Welcome to Left Reckoning 180. Matt Leck here. Dave free, and not like Kendrick Lamar, Griscom out this week. We're doing a little bit of summer hours this week. We're going to be releasing for all of y'all in just a little bit a conversation that was originally released for members with Darna Noor and Griscom about Texas oil baron interfering in politics, if you can believe it. And for members right now at patreon.com/Left Reckoning, a conversation we had with Sean KB of the Antifada, and you'll get a little bit of a taste at the end of this as well. But that conversation is to do with another Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters going to the RNC. And Sean, people might not know, but Sean's been rankling a little bit of feathers. Is that ruffling a little bit of feathers with his takes on that? But I think there's some sensible things and to talk about with that. So check that out. Before I send you over to Darna, though, I did want to comment on very briefly, because we'll obviously talk about it when David's back and the smoke clears a little bit. Venezuelan elections. Now, let me get personal a little bit as I'm hosting solo. I'm an agnostic, searching sort of guy. So I consider knowledge provisional. I don't stake. I'm always open to new information. So I'm not going to make any guarantees regarding the Venezuelan electoral process. I will note, I think significantly, that Lula has said that he's somewhat satisfied with the process. I don't take that on, faith, but I think it's more that I defer. I think some facts we're just refreshing ourselves on. Folks might remember this tweet, which is one of the all-time, I think, Congress people using Twitter moments. Chris Murphy of Connecticut tweet out this. Then it got real embarrassing. This is August 4th, 2020. In April 2019, we tried to organize a kind of coup. Everyone who told us they'd route to Guaido got cold feet, and the plan failed publicly and spectacularly, making America look weak and foolish. Now, the warrant for that was restoring democracy, but are we sure that's why?
You sure about that? You sure about that? That's why?
Because you notice that we don't seem to be so keen for opportunities with other undemocratic, say, oil-producing regimes. For instance, Saudi Arabia, Texas. It's also a fact that the first thing I saw about the supposed electoral fraud, and there's stuff about, electoral machine tallies and, polling irregularities that deserve to be looked into. I don't think, Latin American countries saying release those are necessarily wrong. I just think they have more of a say than America does in this front. Elon Musk retweeting obvious lies to do with people apparently stealing ballot boxes, and you look at these ballot boxes and it's very clearly air conditioners. But James North has a piece in the Nation magazine that I think is sort of on my wavelength here, and his headline: the Maduro government is probably stealing the election in Venezuela, but maintaining economic warfare by the U.S. including sanctions only hurts the Venezuelan people. I think that you can take his assertion re Maduro as you please. I would say I think it's worth staking out a position, even if you think Maduro would never, that even if he did, it's not for us to coup the MFer. Because I fully, think that the right-wing opposition is also even if they didn't win the election, would try to steal it. It sometimes happens in democracies that both sides try to steal the election. America in 1960 would be a case study in that, I think, arguably. But North writes, even though the Nicolas Maduro government in Venezuela is almost certainly stealing Sunday's election, the Biden-Harris administration should still end the harsh economic warfare against the country. Here are 3 reasons. After Donald Trump imposed total U.S. sanctions in 2017, a humanitarian disaster soon followed. Mark Weisbrod, a respected economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, explains that curtailing Venezuela's oil exports and blocking its access to international finance contributed to an economic collapse that was worse than the Great Depression in the United States. Weisbrod contends that the sanctions helped cause tens of thousands of additional deaths. Also, maintaining the economic blockade will continue. You can check out the piece yourself. I think it's fairly obvious, including the issue that the Trump administration turned the screws despite knowing, and maybe it was a positive byproduct, that it would cause migration of Venezuelans into this country, because they obviously know that that's a good issue for them. They aren't actually that afraid to it, because Trump uses illegal immigrant labor at his golf courses and stuff. But, whether you take the assertions regarding Maduro, whatever, I think, again, I think it's plausible that both sides might be up to some things that aren't great. But again, I also think, this is the important point here, which is how this article ends. And it's where I landed today as well. North writes, besides ending the economic sanctions, the United States should just sit back and say little or nothing. Decades of brutal U.S. interventions in Latin America have destroyed our government's credibility. Instead, America should concentrate on humanely treating the Venezuelan migrants whom our harsh policy helped create when they reach our southern border. Let Latin Americans, both leaders and ordinary people, continue responding to the crisis, and for once let Venezuelans themselves make their own history. I think that's well put, and I think that encompasses a lot of different possible contingencies in how this plays out. Because again, like the assertion from Maduro's folks were that there was some sort of hacking attempt that slowed down the processing. It's totally plausible to me that that is right, and Maduro is completely innocent. It's also plausible to me that, again, both sides might be up to a little bit no good. I don't think that honestly, if the vote tally, like the opposition said they won like 73%, I kind of doubt that even more than I doubt Maduro's. But take that with all a grain of salt. I'm not, again, making any guarantees on this stuff. I think what North said there should be agreeable to anybody regardless of where you end up on, because it's kind of like, if Assad did use chemical weapons, it's one thing to argue he would never, and we lied about it, but if he did, it's still not a reason to intervene, right? Like these sorts of suggestions that certain leaders would never, it's possible, and often it is malicious lying. But I think there's other principles that are maybe even more important to keep in mind. But again, maybe David will have a different perspective on that. Here's Darna Noor, and after that, a little taste of Sean. But if you want the full Sean discussion, patreon.com/leftreckoning.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David Griscom here, and I'm very thrilled to be joined by a return guest on Left Reckoning, who is a reporter and writer at The Guardian, Darna Noor. How are you doing, friend? I'm
good. It's nice to be back here. Wow, returning.
I know. I'm really happy to have you back. We always have such a good time having you on the program. And, I will just say every time we have you on, it's always really exciting to talk about your work because you're covering so much really exciting stuff. And this story here is a little close to home for me, but you wrote a very, very great profile in The Guardian about Tim Dunn, who is quite the character. I mean, why don't you introduce this figure to our audience who might not be as familiar with him?
Yeah, I will say that I was not super familiar with him until a couple of years ago when I started hearing more about him in sort of Texas oil circles. And I feel like generally, unless you pay a lot of attention to like oil billionaires generally, or you're in Texas, you probably don't know this guy's name yet. But he, he's again, like an oil billionaire. He's from West Texas, from the sort of like the heart of the Permian Basin. And he's spent millions and millions of dollars pushing the Texas GOP to the far right over the past decade and a half. And like really playing in that field. Like his realm has not been like, protecting the GOP from like, Democratic candidates or anything like that. He's fully like, he's running Republicans against Republicans in order to push them farther right. He's a Christian nationalist. He is a pastor, like an active pastor at a church that he owns. He also owns a compound with a private school, like a private Bible school that he runs across the street. Super kind of like protectionist, bizarre character, who also has like his kind of fingers in many things and does not talk to media. So I didn't get to talk to him.
No, I mean, for how influential he is and how much I think I shouldn't say people know him. I think more like people maybe who write about Texas know him. Like it's very clear he's playing a major role in this state. I mean, nationally too, as we'll get into in a second. Yeah. But yeah, it is sort of surprising how quiet he can be. I mean, I want to get into him and his like ideology, but before we jump into that, like, what is the kind of larger stakes for people maybe outside of Texas? I mean, a lot of people, might not be, might accept Texas as a kind of conservative Republican run state. Why is somebody like Tim Dunn alarming for somebody who might not be too invested in the state?
Yeah, I mean, so for a really long time, he's primarily focused on Texas, but more recently, he's gotten super involved in national politics. And this has been like a pretty rapid shift. In 2016, he supported Ted Cruz's run and gave him like a little bit of money for his presidential campaign. In 2020, he gave Trump, $500,000, which is not, obviously that is more money than like I will ever have, but for him, it's not huge. But now he's like cemented himself as a top 10 Trump donor. He's the 8th largest contributor to Trump's campaign. And he made a $5 million donation last year. He also is now like, kind of in with all of these far right think tanks that are providing Trump with like policy proposals and stuff like this. He works with a bunch of like Trump aligned people. We can talk about Brad Parscale, for instance, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, who we've talked about before on here. So he's not only a Trump donor, but he's like deep in sort of Trump world right now too.
And I have to say it's kind of interesting, and I might be a little bit outside the scope of this piece here. But it's interesting to see, I think, some of these more like Christian fundamentalist types trying to influence Trump, because it seems like there's a lot of money maybe trying to entice him in a different direction, not, in a kind of secular position, let's say. But yeah. I just wonder how much influence that kind of like fire and brimstone kind of Christian nationalist politics, at least the old style version of it, it has in Trump world right now.
No, I mean, I totally agree. I've kind of always found this really fascinating and frankly pretty confusing. Because Trump is taking massive amounts of funding from this guy, but then is also going on the debate stage and being like, now that Roe versus Wade is overturned, I'm not going to be for a federal abortion ban and things like this. I want to leave those decisions up to the states. So it doesn't seem like, at least yet, it doesn't seem like there's like a sort of direct, appeal in a lot of ways to the sort of more Christian nationalist parts of the party. Although since he got shot, it does seem like he's talking about God a little more. And I wonder if that's like a strategy thing or just like when you get shot, you start thinking a little bit more about God.
Yeah, I mean, and as we all saw, the American flag twisted itself up into the symbol of an angel. So, there might be some signs here of the divine. But I mean, all right, well, let's yeah. So I mean, on the national level, it's going to be interesting to see how he's able to play. But I mean, I think it's some people might not have a sense of the scope of the influence of this. I mean, look, Texas, we sometimes like to present it this way. A lot of people think of it this way, as like this super tiny rural state. It is a major American state. Over 30 million people live here. It's a very significant place for a lot of reasons. Could you talk about how Dunn plays in politics? If I'm a Republican politician, how am I interacting with somebody like Dunn?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on if he's for you or against you, really. He plays in basically every political arena. He's like a big backer of like certain media outfits. He basically spearheaded this thing called the Texas scorecard, where he'll like literally make report cards for candidates based on how much he basically how much he likes them. It's just wild. And he pours a lot of money into primarying again. So if you're a Republican candidate and you are not for something that Dunn's into, then he will pour lots and lots of money into primarying you, from the right with another Republican ticket. Honestly, not even necessarily from, like, a lot of the people who he's primarying are far right already. They're just like not his flavor of far right. And he has sort of like I'll say I went into this piece thinking that I could do some kind of like very, like some kind of like just material analysis, being like, look, he doesn't really care about all of these like ideological things. He's really just into like protecting his own business. And I think that there's like not actually very much evidence that that's true in this case. His business isn't oil, but his like sort of pet issues are more about, he was behind this like successful abortion ban in Texas, bans on like access to trans healthcare, and then also like a bunch of like making sure that you say that you like learn the Bible in schools, and like completely ruining any access to public education and stuff like this. So he really is like deep in the, I guess, what you might call like culture war stuff, even though he's, making his money in oil. And if you, as a Republican candidate, are not on his side with some of those things, he will primary you. And he might lose, but he's not deterred by that. Like, he has endless amounts of money and he'll just do it again.
So I don't know if you how much you got into the Texas scorecard, Darna, during your reporting, but they've put out some just unbelievably unhinged documentaries, which I have to admit I have a good time watching. But just to give you a flavor, like some of the more recent one is the Texas heist. Do Democrats run the Texas House? And for people who don't know, Republicans have been in control of the Texas House, since I was a kid. After the heist, and Hubris, the Texas Kingmakers. And all of these movies are basically making this argument that a select few of Republicans in the Texas House of Representatives are actually secret Democrats. And only the small group of like real grassroots. And this is what's really great about the argument too. Is like, oh, this is about the grassroots standing up against the machine. When literally this is an organization that gets their funding from one of the wealthiest people in the state, somebody who's very heavy-handedly trying to influence the political direction of the state to fit into his vision. And it's pretty amazing that this gets presented always as like, this is the grassroots of the Texas Republican Party.
Yeah, totally. I'm super curious, like, when you became aware of the Texas scorecard and like Dunn's influence.
I mean, I've always known the Texas scorecard because I've always been interested in, so I mean, it's been years, but I've always been interested in like since Texas is like a one-party state and has been a one-party state for a long time. The Texas scorecard is a really great way to get a sense of like how these fights are building up. Now, I started paying a hell of a lot more attention to them during the Ken Paxton impeachment, which is where a lot of I don't have time to like explain this trial to folks, but like Ken Paxton is like one of the most corrupt politicians in the country. It is unbelievable the kind of stuff that he has been involved in, and he, gets impeached because he's basically using our government here, the Attorney General's office of Texas, to do favors for major political donors. He has all these other kind of, ethics issues. Anyways, if somebody's going to have an impeachment trial against him, it's like Ken Paxton is like a perfect candidate. And they put the hammer down on these Republicans who said, hey, I actually don't think it's a good idea for the state to be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay off victims of Ken Paxton's abuse of power, which was something that was happening regularly, right? Ken Paxton would get sued. The state would have to pony up significant amounts of money to cover Ken Paxton. And Republicans, it's very funny that it was the kind of, purse strings kind of arguments, like we don't want to waste their money on this kind of thing. But that created this division in the Republican Party, and Dunn and that faction have come down hard on all of those folks since, who voted for Ken Paxton's impeachment.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also, just like complete king shit. I promise that if I ever am elected to some sort of like very powerful position in Texas, I will make sure that I use all of the public funds I can to, I don't know, like send you a margarita machine or something like that.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'll tell you, I'd appreciate that. But I mean, given how much that Ken Paxton gives to his folks, I would be a little insulted, Darna, if you were only giving me a margarita machine.
Okay, but, you're right. I'll work on it.
I need some real stuff here. No, but I mean, anyways, look, this is just sort of like questions of like good or bad government. But this is somebody whose like hand has been involved in Texas, politics in an immense way, not just in making sure, as you were saying, that the Republican Party stays in power, but a certain brand of Republican politics stays in power. Now, you noted something about him, about his, religious background and this school here. I think a really important note, added context as well, is that one of the big things that they're pushing for at the scorecard right now is school privatization, what they call vouchers. Could you talk a little bit about, this kind of fascination that somebody like Tim Dunn has with maybe privatized schools, and particularly with religious instruction? Because I just want to be really clear, people, this is different from just like charter schools. This is allowing potentially public money being taken out of the public system to go to religious schools that somebody like Tim Dunn is very fond of.
Yeah, exactly. They want to gut public education to fund private school vouchers for like Christian ed instead. Basically, they want to use all of the money that we're putting into the public sector for education and move it over to the private sector. It's really wild, and it's like a wild thing for him to be focusing his energies on, but it makes some amount of sense. I talked to this historian, Darren Dochek, who sort of like focuses specifically on the relationship of, like the rise of fossil capital, I guess you might say, and Christian nationalism. And he basically said that it's like super, super common for oil billionaires, especially from West Texas, especially from this sort of like protectionist place in West Texas, where your whole thing is about like, surviving in Dust Bowl country and keeping the state out of your life. It's super common for those kinds of folks to be really into private schools. And it also like makes some amount of sense with the way that he's made his like insane fortune too. Like having support for private religious schooling could protect like what he thinks of as quote unquote family values, maintain the sort of like hegemony of evangelical extremism, but then also like ensure that students are learning like a reverence for like free market economics, whatever that actually means to him. And so I think it's all sort of like, this is a guy who I don't think sees the social issues and the economic issues and the religious issues as at all separate. For him, it's like all one sort of like divine mission that he's on to, extract more oil and to protect his family and to make more money. And I think a really big part of that for him is like maintaining hegemony, which you can do if you have, if the schools are in your camp, basically.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, just to sort of put some meat on it for folks who again don't know him, when we talk about his like version of Christianity, the things that he believes, can you give people a little bit of that flavor? Is it seven? What is the Seventh-day Adventist? Yeah,
or they're like the Dominion is like he basically it's like it is a super like by definition sort of xenophobic form of Christianity that specifically focuses on evangelizing via a number of different like aspects of society, whether that's like, media specifically, seeing that as like a sort of as your divine purpose to evangelize, via the market, via politics. And I mean, I guess I probably don't even have to say that he's like, pretty clearly like a racist in this way too. I mean, he like explicitly has said that like only Christian people should lead the Texas legislature. He said that to Joe Strauss, who is Jewish. Just like completely wild, like, even for the right. I feel like he's like a caricature of the sort of like socially like far right guy that you might paint a picture of in your head. And again, like sees all of his political activity as an extension of his Christianity. And so all of his political work is kind of inflected with this particular flavor of evangelical Christianity too.
So, I mean, obviously he made his money in oil, but like, could you give people a little bit of a background here about how he was able to amass like such extreme wealth? You know, I mean, this is not somebody, I don't know. This is a different kind of wealth than the ones that you see like in the suburbs of Dallas or Houston or Austin. You know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, he's a multi-billionaire, and he could soon be. He could soon have even more money because his fracking company just got sold to like a sort of major oil company, and that could give him another like $2 billion in his pocket. He basically made his money on making a really good bet. He like bought up a bunch of wells in the Permian Basin before fracking was even a thing. So like in the what is it, the 90s, I guess, he bought up a bunch of wells. He had previously been like a sort of boss at like another fracking firm. He then went into like kind of oil finance, and then he started buying up these oil wells in West Texas that he had no idea of this at the time, but like a decade later, after the fracking boom started, became extremely valuable. Like that's now the reason that West Texas is like on the level of any like sort of Middle Eastern oil fields. And it's kind of the reason that the US is like the world's top producer of oil right now. He couldn't have known that that's the case, but he made a really good bet. It turned out well for him. And he invested a lot of that money, like as soon as he started making it in politics. So yeah, definitely not like a kind of ordinary like guy with a McMansion. He's like a serious levels of wealth.
You know, and just talking about luck though, he sort of got lucky twice, right? I mean, the big one is getting the money, but the second one is like getting involved in politics at the time that he did, right? Yeah. When Texas basically went from a contested or historically to Democrat even state to one that is just extremely solidly Republican. So your money goes a long way in that system.
Yeah, it's 100% true. Although, I mean, I feel like there was a moment in the 90s where maybe he was not going to be like as sort of like ultra right as he was. He was a delegate to the Texas Republican Convention in the mid 90s, and wasn't, I mean, I don't know. I can't look into the guy's soul or something. But it seems sort of like he seized on the opportunity for that like super far right push, as you're saying, as it arose, that in the like sort of late 90s through now. So yeah, he was in the right place at the right time in some ways too.
You know, I mean, just the quickest version of this, and this is like painting with a super broad brush, but like, you know, basically Bush defeats Ann Richards, and then we just have domination pretty much from then out, right? And there are like kind of three cycles of it. Like the first cycle, and what the Bush Republicans did was it was about lawsuit reform. Like Texas used to be a great place to be a trial attorney because Texas juries fucking hated big companies and they loved to give a lot of money to victims of corporate abuse. Well, they thought there was something wrong with that. That's what they all ran on. That's what the governor now, Greg Abbott, that's what Bush ran on. This was a huge part of the Republican takeover. That goes on for a while. And then you start to see this kind of Rick Perry generation, which is a little bit more about, you know, returning, not that there wasn't always a religious aspect, but becomes a little bit more explicit and a larger part of it. And now you have Greg Abbott in this current formation, which I think is particularly interesting because it certainly is extremely socially conservative. But it's a very far cry from the party of W. Bush. In fact, like these are people who are now not respected and not honored and revered in the Republican Party. And it's been interesting to see. I mean, we could do a whole thing on Greg Abbott and because he's kind of fascinating. But if you watch somebody like Dunn, who's getting involved in politics at this time, you can almost see this kind of magnet of his money and influence in Texas politics from what they are pushing now versus what they were pushing in the late 90s.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really good way of putting it. And I agree. Like that was the moment where, you know, oil billionaires like Dunn had the opportunity, it seems, to make that extremely far right push in a way that they might not have been able to do that before. I feel like it's like a first you get rid of the, like the liberals, basically. And then it's like, and then you get rid of like the sort of normie Republicans. And who are you left with is like these guys.
And it's wild. I mean, to talk about some scandal, are you familiar? You're familiar with the Nick Fuentes story, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, Dunn gave money to, or no, it was the Defend Texas Liberty guy, right?
Defend Texas Liberty, yeah.
He like runs I should let you do this. He runs like a sort of far right think tank, and like sort of like a PAC, Defense Texas Liberty. Last year, I guess it was like last fall, a state legislature who they gave a bunch of money, who like Dunn's PAC basically gave a shitload of money, met with Nick Fuentes at his office, was just like obviously a bad look. And that was like one of a number of scandals in sort of like Tim Dunn world over the course of a couple of years. Am I getting the details on that? Right?
Yeah. No, and it's really, I mean, the meeting was like 6 hours, right? And the funniest thing is this is going on during this thing. Well, when Ken Paxton is just impeached. Dan Patrick, who's the lieutenant governor, like sort of came out after that impeachment and was like ready to wage war against all of these members of the Republican Party. And Dade Phelan, who's the Speaker of the Texas House, who's on the other side of it, who voted for, who presided over the impeachment, said, hey, anybody who's gotten any money from an organization that's meeting with like the #1 Nazi in the country should return that money. And it was right after, it was just such an insane confluence of stuff. It was right after the October 7th attacks. So Dan Patrick goes on Twitter and he says, how dare somebody, invoke questions of like anti-Semitism when Texas is standing with Jewish people in their deepest hour of need. No, and basically he's like, no, I will not be returning the $3 million that I just got from this bag.
Exactly. And of course, like then they shut the PAC down. Dan Patrick. Also, like, I don't know. I guess that I'm always surprised to hear how much power the lieutenant governor in Texas has as opposed to the governor himself. It kind of, I mean, he seems like in some ways like a sort of rogue actor in some cases, Dan Patrick. The whole system is rogue at this point. I mean, there's a whole other thing, but like, Greg Abbott, first, Texas was called, it's like a weak governor system. So the governor's not supposed to have a lot of power at all. And Abbott has actually just taken a lot of it. But yeah, no, the lieutenant governor is typically like the most powerful person in the state. And no, I mean, they are completely stomping on the Constitution. They're making it up as they go. But the thing is, like, who was there to challenge them? I mean, they control they control the party, which is the only thing that matters, even more so than like actually holding those seats. And the only thing that would stop them would be, the legislature, which is firmly Republican. And even these kind of small things. Well, I mean, in any kind of normal political world, Ken Paxton would have been impeached, or kicked out of office. The House found him guilty. The Senate acquitted him. But they didn't, because they in front of everybody, in front of the entire state, it was a very, very clear and naked kind of example of like how much power folks like Dunn have, and folks like obviously Patrick, Paxton, and Abbott have. And the kind of the interesting question that I don't have an answer for, and I mean, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it, is like, who fundamentally has the most power? Is it Patrick or is it Dunn? Right? Is it Abbott? It's like, because both of these are very powerful groups. Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't know the answer to that. It seems like, I guess I'm impressed by like how on the same page these guys always seem to be. Like Dan Patrick in that moment, obviously he's not going to like cut ties with Dunn. He's not going to be like, yeah, here you go, here's your millions of dollars back. But he could like start to distance himself from Dunn over the months after that, and he's not done that. And I don't know if that's an indicator that like Dunn, has control of the purse strings, and so that means that he really has the power. I mean, also, obviously, now Dunn seems to have Trump's ear in some way. Dan Patrick seems to be very interested in like a sort of going national with this sort of like Texas style of republicanism. I don't know. I'm very curious also to know who has the real power here.
Yeah. And just, for folks who don't know, like we had this big fight over school vouchers. It was very contentious, and Dunn and those guys, they put a lot of money into these races. They won a lot of those seats. They weren't able to get Dave Phelan, who is the kind of like embodiment of the problem, but they have a very significant majority going into this potential next legislative session to push something like a Dunn style Texas voucher program. TBD there. But before I let you go, I mean, I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the oil, specifically, if you could talk a little bit about this deal that Dunn wants to see go through, because I think more than anything, that's like the biggest red flag of maybe one of the reasons that Dunn is sort of a little bit more interested in national politics. Yeah,
totally. I think that this is true of like a lot of different oil billionaires who are backing Trump in a big way. There's been all of these obviously reports of like Trump being like meeting with all these oil executives and saying like, you guys should give me $1 billion and I'll like, maybe not in exchange, but basically saying like, I'll get rid of like dozens of environmental regulations and stuff. It seems like one of the big things that oil executives are asking for is the ability to go through with these deals to consolidate power among fewer and fewer oil companies. So like, Exxon, for instance, purchased like another sort of top Permian oil business, like another sort of top driller in the West Texas area last year, actually one that Dunn used to work at, which is sort of interesting. There's been some of these other sort of like major consolidation questions in the past few years. And in this case, it's Occidental Petroleum, which again is like a sort of big oil major, run by somebody who's been very present at many of these sort of like Trump fundraisers and meetings and things like that, who agreed to buy the drilling firm Crown Quest, which Dunn basically runs, for $2.2 billion, I guess it is, or for more than that, but Dunn would get like $2.2 billion. The Crown Quest itself is like, this is probably too wonky to be of interest, but if folks are interested, basically, Crown Rock is the company that got sold. It's like a partnership between Dunn and a private equity firm called Lime Rock. So his fracking company is called Crown Rock, or called Crown Quest. He partners with Lime Rock. They make Crown Rock. That's how that went. It was a part of a really big sort of move to get private equity dollars into the sort of fossil fuel business around that time. And this is not going to be the only, like, he's certainly not the only guy who's vying for his big deal to go through. There are lots and lots of these like smaller companies that are in the process of getting kind of eaten up by the bigger oil companies. And a lot of those folks are going to be trying to protect their interests, obviously, when it comes to who's in the White House. And Trump has, all but promised to allow those deals to go through without a hitch. So if you're wondering like what's in it for them, that is certainly a big piece of what's in it for them.
Well, Darna Noor, it's always wonderful speaking to you. We'll have a link below to that piece. People can follow your work in The Guardian. Anything people should have their eyes out for in the near future? So be out this Sunday.
I wish I had an answer to this.
There's always something, if you follow Darna, Darna's putting out just amazing work. It's really incredible.
Oh, you're so kind. What else? I just found out that Shell basically didn't publicize that they backed away from their big plan to do chemical recycling. That's another thing that you can go read that I wrote. They said nothing about it, but they've been pushing. Chemical recycling is basically like a really very polluting form of not actually recycling, but like you take a bunch of chemicals and mix them with plastics, and then you can turn them into fuel and things like this. But it's really energy intensive and very polluting. We might need some of it, but generally seems like it's not working out very well. Anyways, Shell said that they were going to put a bunch of money into that. They walked it back and they didn't tell anyone about that. So that's another very wonky thing that I've been working on over at The Guardian.
Well, I'm very glad that you're keeping your eye on that, because we're not going to get too many announcements from them, I don't think, on a lot of things. Yeah. But again, really appreciate it.
Appreciate you having me. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. And we're really stoked to be joined again by Sean KB. You know him from the Antifada. How you doing, brother?
I'm great. It's good to be here on a bit of a reunion with you and Matt Leck, considering that Matt Leck was the initial producer on our podcast back in the old MR days. So always happy to talk with you guys.
Was that like 1994? I think we did.
I believe so. It was in the Clinton administration. I know that much. Remember we had Al Gore on to talk about communization. That was dope.
And the lockbox. Yeah.
And
exactly.
the lockbox. The Social Security lockbox will be protected through communization.
Exactly.
Well, as much as I would love to just tell old war stories, we got to talk about something that's got people pretty worked up, which is this speech here from the Teamsters president, Sean O'Brien, at the Republican National Convention. And it's been a pretty... SOB, which is like incredible acronym, by the way.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunately, it's been a little bit of a slow news week, so there's not much else to talk about, but happy we could finally get back to it. I'm just going to play a quick section from it just to give everyone a little flavor in case you missed it. And then I'd like to hear your just kind of like initial reaction. And we can talk about, a bunch of other things connected to it.
Together to form unions. But for a century, major employers have waged a war against labor by forming corporate unions of their own. We need to call the Chamber of Commerce and the business roundtables what they are. They are unions for big business. And here's another fact. Against gigantic multinational corporation, an individual worker has zero power. It's only when Americans band together in democratic unions that we win real improvements on wages, benefits, and working conditions. Companies like Amazon are bigger than most national economies. Amazon is valued over $2 trillion. That makes it the 14th largest economy in the world. What is sickening is that Amazon has abandoned any national allegiance. Amazon's sole focus is on lining its own pockets. Remember, elites have no party, elites have no nation. Their loyalty is to the balance sheet and to the stock price at the expense of the American worker.
So I do love that version of it too, with the Trump split screen, because it shows maybe how far it was going. But I mean, just curious, like your kind of first initial reactions to the speech as it came out.
Well, I didn't watch the RNC live except for the first 30 minutes of Trump's speech where he recounted the assassination attempt, which I thought was fascinating to watch because it was like he had this crowd enraptured and he's talking about a very serious attempt on his life that, would have succeeded. And I love chaos. So like, I'm not going to say where I'd fall on that, but I love chaos. It almost happened, but then it didn't. So I watched that part of it, but I took note of the O'Brien speech though. And I sat down, watched 17 minutes of it and took notes and whatever. And took it seriously as like as a statement from a union leader who has hundreds of thousands of members under him and was trying to do something relatively new politically, something that probably hasn't been done in like 50 years in the United States, which is to try to cynically and opportunistically, and I'm not even sure genuinely, but try to play both ends against the middle. Try to break out of the, Democrat Party monopoly for trade unions, try to go and suck up to some of like the worst fucking people in America in the capacity as a union leader, somebody who has responsibility over negotiating and setting the structures for the economic lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. So I sat down and I watched it and I took copious notes on the thing. And I think the optics of it aside, because it's obviously caused a huge debate, controversy within not just the left, but like labor, organized labor, rank and file, and leadership in general. But I think as like boilerplate like labor statements. There wasn't all that much in this speech that was different. There was a lot in this speech that was, I think, attuned towards an audience that was ready to hear it. Like in that last clip that you just played, he's basically blaming globalists. This could be like a Curtis Yarvin statement about how the United States has gone from a republic, a democracy where like native people stand up for their rights, into an economic zone, like globalists have come. But that's not surprising rhetoric. We shouldn't be surprised by this. And the fact that so many people on the left were surprised by this indicates to me, A, that they don't really know their labor history all that well, which is fine. But also that they're pretty naive about how these large and powerful institutions work and the intersection between, let's say, economic power and political power, and what's necessary these days for a deformed and corrupted union movement representing in the private sector barely 6% of the U.S. working population, the sort of concessions necessary to keep these deformed organizations running. And I caught some heat online. I don't know if you guys saw that. Did you see I caught some heat online?
Some people were calling you a Nazi for saying.
I got called a fucking Nazi, man. I got the lyrics to a great song, Dead Kennedys, Nazi Punks Fuck Off, tweeted at me, which was a real blast from the past. It was like the 1990s again when the Teamsters were endorsing George H.W. Bush for president.
Well, because you tweeted. Go ahead. All right, friends. And if you want to hear the rest of that, head on over to patreon.com/leftreckoning to hear the rest of that conversation with Sean, which was a lot of fun, wasn't it, Matt?
It was, and that's true for every single Sunday, folks. There's a Sunday show coming out for you. Go get it at patreon.com/leftreckoning.
All right, see y'all there.